Well, welcome everybody. I'm glad you're all here. Thanks for coming to my artist talk. So I think the talk itself will be about 25 to 30 minutes or so, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So I will ask that you please stay muted until that Q&A session, and then just because sometimes background noise can come in and things like that. So that'll make it easier. Although if for some reason my tech stops working or anything, or you can't hear me anymore, please step in and let me know. I'd rather find that out as soon as it happens than like 5 minutes later and have to backtrack. And also just as so you're aware, this meeting will be recorded and it'll be published through Purdue on YouTube actually eventually as a recorded talk. So thanks for coming here today. I'm glad you'll get a chance to hear some more about my artwork. My name is Matthew McHugh, as you all know, and I'm a third-year graduate student here at Purdue University. So I've been studying drawing, painting, and printmaking here. And today I'll mostly be talking about my thesis exhibition, although it is sort of a comprehensive artist talk as well. I'll be talking about the current concepts within my art, the symbolism that I use, some related artists to my work, the evolution of my concepts over time, and some material aspects within my art. So before I get into the content, I just wanted to show you a quick video of the gallery space. So I know some of you are here at Purdue and you've had a chance to see this show, but many of you are from out of town. So this is just kind of a kind of video tour of the space. So first on this northeast wall over here, I have the TV with one of my animated charcoal videos. And then on this north wall, I have 7 smaller works. So these first 3 are mezzotints, and most of these are printmaking techniques, actually. The next 3 are dry point prints, these 3 here. And then there's 1 graphite drawing at the end here. And then on this wall, the west wall, I have 4 large charcoal drawings. These are about 3 by 4 feet each. And then on the south end of the east wall, I have a projection of my second animated charcoal video. So hopefully that gives you some idea of the space, but I know I passed over those kind of quickly. So just so you know, I will be showing you all of these pieces in just a little bit more detail throughout the talk. So you'll get a chance to see those again. If you felt rushed, don't worry, we'll coming back to those. So to summarize my concepts within my art in a sentence, I create visual spaces that are analogies for my own consciousness. So in a sense, they're spatial self-portraits. As I discuss my concepts, I'll just be going through some of my thesis show work in the background. And you can see the titles and labels and years here down at the bottom. So the title of my thesis show, which is Threshold, is a reference to the in-between spaces of the self. So a threshold is a transitional region between usually an interior and an exterior space, such as the threshold of a doorway. Since a threshold exists between 2 defined spaces, it serves as an analogy for the complex and undefinable aspects of what it is to experience life as a human individual. When it comes to making sense of experiences, we often use simple binary categories, such as inside versus outside, self versus other, healthy versus sick, or mental versus physical, to make sense of ourselves in the world. And even though this generalization is convenient, it often comes at the expense of leaving out the middle ground or the liminal spaces. The often overlooked liminal spaces between those category landmarks are where most of life actually happens. One example of a common binary that's often applied to the self is mind versus body, or mind-body dualism, as if those are clearly separable things, but there are very physical aspects to the mind with the brain, and you also actually have the whole nervous system extending throughout the entire body, as well as, you know, in order to inform the nervous system, it kind of requires external stimuli from outside the body as well. And so there's not really a very clear boundary when it comes to mind versus body or mental versus physical, even though it's convenient sometimes to portray it that way. When it comes to introspection, I personally find that the more simplifications like this that you compound, such as mind versus body, the further away you get from any semblance of accuracy. So ironically, in this way, I actually believe that introspective accuracy is found more in just participating in that complexity, creating or asking questions, and being willing to deconstruct or analyze what makes up oneself, rather than trying to condense and distill all that complexity down to a set of clear answers. And through visualizing my own liminality in my art, I hope to create visual spaces that others can relate to. So with this charcoal piece, it's a 3x4 foot charcoal drawing called Ocean Well. The ocean around this well is going in and out of it because the barrier's been broken down. And in that way, there's not really any clear distinction between what's inside of it or what's outside of it. And that's a reference to how, as individuals, the experiences we have that we would normally consider external to us, such as the people we know or the settings we participate in or events, those kind of things, they actually shape who we are, and they have a huge impact on our internal identity. And so in that way, there's no real clear distinction between what's inside or outside of us. And that's what this is a reference to. Here's a detail side of that as well. So, and if you get a chance to see these in person, they are at a pretty large scale. So it's fun to see them in person if you can. I hope these detail shots are kind of a way to communicate that as well. A lot of my work has to do with incorporating different spaces together that don't necessarily belong together. And again, in that way, it's referencing the lack of clarity between internal and external. So in this charcoal drawing, I have this broom closet-like setting, and yet within the sink, there's a whole different perspective of this ocean that's sitting at a different kind of plane than you are as a viewer within the room. And here's a detail shot of that as well. So one thing that I wanted to reference and acknowledge real quick is that most of my work is representational, or it's drawn to look realistic or believable. And that's really important to me because I want to create a believable sense of space where the viewer can feel as though they're participating in an actual or believable setting. But at the same time, there are some things that keep that in check, such as the fact that these are two-dimensional artworks. They're usually in black and white, and you can see some of the mark making as well, depending on the material that I use. So because that kind of keeps that realistic nature in check, and the settings and contents are also somewhere between the real and the imagined, these settings end up being kind of within one of those liminal spaces. I've developed somewhat of a personal set of symbols over time throughout my work that keep recurring in my artwork. And originally, they kind of made their way into my art intuitively, but as they kept coming up for me, I had to just start thinking about, why are these important to me? They must matter to me in some way, because I keep finding myself really drawn to these symbols. So chairs are one of these symbols that you'll see in several of my pieces within my thesis show. I see chairs as a placeholder for the human presence, since they're created to be occupied almost always by just one individual at a time, and they're usually facing in a direction in which the viewer would be, or the participant would be sitting. So they imply presence and a subject, but at the same time within my work, I actually usually portray them empty. So they are kind of implying absence and presence at the same time. I also often include door frame-like structures, and this is actually the previous shot was a detail shot of this same piece. So this is the full piece, and you can see these door frame-like structures in here as well in combination with the chairs. So the frame-like structures are a reference to that threshold concept that I mentioned for my thesis title, and that is something that, usually you see a threshold of a doorway going between an inside space and an outside space. But within my work, I actually usually have these structures existing on their own within a vast empty space. And in that way, it actually becomes more about the transitional element itself, rather than what it's transitioning to or from. I also have mirrors drawn into many of my pieces. And the quickest symbolism that usually comes to mind with mirrors is self-perception or identity. And that's definitely true with these, but I also really enjoy using them to create an illusion of yet another space. So the drawing itself is already an illusion of a space, but the mirrors create more spaces that you have kind of mixed access to, where you can look into them as a viewer, and yet you're actually seeing what's behind you or away from you in different areas. And this is a detail of this piece as well. With this one too, I actually ended up using them to break up the horizon line a little bit as well. Many of my pieces also have these kind of somber, vast, empty spaces, like with this mezzotint, even though this piece is actually very small, it's only 6 by 9 inches. But I create these vast, empty spaces because I want each piece to feel as if it's almost like a landscape of consciousness somewhat, or of a self. I have to be careful with my wording. I oftentimes want to say it's like a mental landscape, but that's not quite true, and that kind of contradicts the what I was mentioning earlier with the lack of boundaries between mental and physical. But it is difficult because we have certain sets of words that we're used to using when it comes to talking about these kinds of things. So I like to refer them more as landscapes of the self, or sometimes of consciousness. And each person, each self, only has their own one perspective, point of view on things. Everybody only participates in life from their own point of view. I think it's good to try to grow that and expand that through empathy and trying to see other people's, but we all really will eventually only see life from our own first person perspective. And that's why almost always these spaces are either completely empty, or I'll just have one figure in them, which is a reference to kind of that solitary nature of participating in these self spaces. I also include water and oceans fairly often within my work, or large bodies of water. And water is something that's a pretty complicated symbol. There's countless meanings for it, depending on your cultural context or what you're trying to make with it. Interestingly enough, for me, there's kind of two reasons that I use water. One is just to create a new sense of space that you have, again, mixed access to, kind of like with the mirrors. So with water, at least large bodies of water, you can see the surface of it, and yet you can't see what's beneath it. So it implies another deeper sense of space, and we have no idea what's down there as a viewer. And so there's a sense of mystery with that, where you only have limited access to that space. Personally, I also have kind of a complicated relationship with water, actually. One of my favorite experiences is being on beaches or in vast expanses of water, or places where I can see really far and just enjoy natural landscapes. But at the same time, I actually kind of have a unreasonably strong fear of deep bodies of water, or being out of water where I can't see what's beneath me. I think it's technically called thalassophobia or something like that. But so I do have a very mixed relationship with water myself. There are so many artists who have inspired my work, but I just wanted to mention two of them here. So Agata Derda is a printmaker who is actually Polish, and most of her work actually is a combination between digitally printed black and white landscape images, and she'll use linoleum cuts on top of them or in combination with them to create these sort of spaces like this that reside between the real and the imagined. And she also has a lot of interesting textural variety, because a linoleum cut, you can make your, you can use different mark making to make your positive and negative areas and have different textures and different values. But the photography, the printed photos in the background, are more of a smooth grayscale. They're not quite as, you can't quite see the mark making as directly. Conceptually, most of her work has to do with human self-contextualization. So how do we make sense of ourselves in relation to our context? And that's something that is really interesting to me within my own ideas as well. Olafur Eliasson is another artist whose work I've really enjoyed, and he mostly works with installations and sculptures. This was a piece that he had at the Tate Museum actually in 2003, and really wish I could have seen this in person because it looks fantastic. But what he did was he used a series of lighting and other things to create this implied indoor and outdoor space combined, where it looks like there's a sun setting within an actual building. And one way that he expanded this space is the lighting for that sun-like form it's actually only the bottom half that's really there. And then the ceiling is actually kind of a reflective surface. So it looks like there are two halves to it, but the top half is actually reflected. And that ceiling space allows the viewers to actually participate in it as well, where they can see themselves within the space, but it also makes it feel like a really grand and monumental scale where you've got this really tall feeling to it. He even included mist and fog machines to exaggerate the atmospheric perspective, and the kind of strange, liminality of a space like this, where it's an outdoor space within an indoor space, is something that I just found really fascinating. And it's a similar feeling to what I want to go for within my own images. My concepts have changed some over time, although there are some things that have stayed consistent within my work. In 2018 and 2019, and even earlier, really within a lot of my undergrad program, a lot of my work actually was kind of focused on creating paradoxical narratives, or using different symbolism and imagery that didn't quite go together to try to create a new situation. This was usually a reference to the instability of the ways that we perceive our own reality, but just by kind of trying to shake it up and make new realities basically within these works. And in pieces like this dry point print, I moved later into trying to symbolize the structures that we use to perceive reality specifically. So in this case, there's this figure that's kind of trapped within this very defined geometric structure, and the space that this figure is in does not really fit within this natural space. They kind of have different perspectives, and it's kind of a flattened space versus a more three-dimensional space. But many of my pieces had combinations of things to kind of point to those paradoxical stories. And in this one, there's kind of a solitary figure within this somewhat abstracted space. Again, that is sort of a reference to that self-contextualization that we talked about with Agatha Derrida's work. And in this charcoal drawing, this has to do again with some of that paradoxical narrative, where you can see that these are observers of something, and yet from our angle, we have no idea what they're looking at, or even if they can see under this cloth, we don't really know whether that's the case from this point of view. I took an installation class in fall of 2019, and that was a course that I really enjoyed and learned a lot from. So we had a building, and each student could take a section of that to respond to with an artistic installation. And what I ended up doing is I was really drawn to this hole in the wall in the back that you can see there, hopefully. And there were all these wood fragments from this paneling that were torn out and on the floor. And I just thought it was a really strange scenario. And there was this weird depth to that hole that I thought was interesting. So I ended up suspending these wood fragments throughout the room to look as if they're almost exploding outward from this area. And I also was working on my first animated drawn charcoal film at the time, which is something that I actually did include as part of my thesis show on that TV that you may have seen earlier. So within this piece, I'm just going to play this video here. The film that I made was about futility and time as kind of a cycle where there's death and reconstruction and rebirth, and then death and reconstruction and rebirth, and things like that over and over. So there was kind of this slow and cyclical nature of time, almost ecclesiastical time, and it was being played through this instantaneous, explosive looking form of time with these wood fragments. So just kind of presenting different time forms interacting together. This class was really useful for me in the sense that it kind of changed the way that I saw art and spaces. So it was the first time I really started thinking about space as a form of communication or as a way to create analogies. And this is mostly where my art started shifting from previously, where I had been focusing more on imagery and narratives. And after this class, I really started gravitating more towards creating these imaginary spaces or illusionistic spaces for viewers to participate in. Within my show, most of the materials of my work consist of either charcoal, forms of printmaking, or animated film. So I wanted to talk about the materiality of my work for a minute. So I have 4 large-scale charcoal drawings in my show, and these are all 3 by 4 feet. One thing I really love about charcoal is it is such a loose and expressive material that it's easy to create these large-scale spaces where you can just cover the page really quickly. And I really love how forgiving charcoal is, in that it really is conducive to layers in my experience. And so you can kind of push and pull areas back, almost like glazing with oil paint, really. And yet you can also get a varied range of detail or those wide expressive marks at the same time. And I love being able to create these large immersive settings that it almost feels as if you could walk right into them. They're so large. Printmaking is something I've fallen in love with really here at Purdue. I have had very little printmaking experience before coming here, and I really enjoyed it here. So there's a lot of things that really draw me to printmaking, actually. It's first off a different way of communicating these small spaces or these kind of self spaces, where with printmaking, they usually are pretty small. The materials used and the methods are usually just more conducive to small imagery. So for an image like this, for example, I'm using tiny scraping tools and needles for the dry point areas, and using those to make an image like this that's really detailed. Whereas with charcoal, I'm often actually literally taking a paper towel and dipping it in, a can of powdered charcoal and just wiping it all over the page. So it really feels like a different process. I'll just kind of flip through some of my printmaking imagery here as I talk about it. But there's also something really interesting to me about the process in creating what's called the matrix. So not like the movie, a printmaking matrix is the surface that you alter in order to create multiple images off of that surface. So in the case of something like this, which is a dry point print, what I actually did is I had a sheet of plexiglass, and I actually scratched all the dark areas that you see now into that sheet of plexiglass with a needle. And some of the gray areas, I actually just used sandpaper to rough it up. So then what happens is I rolled ink over the page, or wiped ink into the plexiglass, and then took a rag and wiped it off. And the smooth areas that are less textured, when you wipe those, the ink comes right off. But the areas that are more textured, where I scratched or used sandpaper, those grab onto that ink and hold it with the texture. Then when you put a sheet of paper on it and run it through a printing press under pressure, you can create these images. So the mark making is really unique, but that creation of those matrices, like with this one, it's a sheet of copper. I almost find that they feel like I'm creating artifacts from my own consciousness. They're like archaeological finds or relics or something from my own consciousness. And then when I'm printing off them, it's almost like a form of communicating those spaces. Here's another dry point print. But printmaking is definitely something that I'll continue in the future. I've really enjoyed that. And then here's the last mezzotint that I have. So I'll play this in the background, but this is my second animated film, which was the one that was on that projector. So it's only about 1 minute and 20 seconds or so, and I have it just repeating. I actually set it up in a way that the last frame, it ends at the same place as the first frame, so it can continue as an unbroken circle. And I initially started this because I wanted to try to figure out how to communicate these self spaces in a way where they also change and evolve, and it feels like you can participate in them over time. So in this piece specifically, you'll see here I drew out this figure kind of walking throughout the scene, and in that way it feels as though you're kind of the first person point of view, participating within your own space of consciousness or self space in a way. And this is something that I really enjoy, being able to make these time-based versions of these spaces. And I'll definitely continue that within the future. So as far as the process itself goes, how I made these is I would start with a sheet of 18 by 24 inch drawing paper. I would draw the first frame with vine charcoal. Actually, these are all made in just vine charcoal, and then photograph it on a tripod. And then I would just draw and erase a little bit, photograph it again, and so on and so forth, until I started creating the illusion of movement at at 12 frames per second. So these are very time-consuming processes, and it's really slow and kind of grueling work, honestly, but it's actually totally worth it when I get to see even just a few seconds. If I make a few seconds within a day, that's a good day's work. And then I get to see the actual illusion of these time-based spaces. So that's something that I'll definitely continue in the future. I may even experiment with audio with these, because both films are actually silent. So don't worry if you're not hearing audio. I should have mentioned that earlier, sorry, but there's no audio with either of these videos. So they're just silent films, but someday I might experiment with having audio or even just some music in the background or something like that. So that's something I could play around with. I've also even thought about working with these digitally even and trying to do a digitally drawn animation, but I do really love the physicality of charcoal. That's probably my favorite material. So it would be, hard to let go of that, I think. And I also am planning, besides making animations and more printmaking in the future, I am really hoping to continue within the academic world and continue exhibiting my artwork. And I would also love to take these ideas that I've had within my thesis show further by trying different materials and different ways of communicating these concepts. So although that concludes the main content of my artist talk, I wanted to take some time to thank a few people who have been a really important part of my journey here. First off, my committee members, so Christine and Jen and Charles. I'm really, really thankful for all of you. You've been so incredibly helpful throughout all 3 years here. Christine is my committee chair, and she's really helped me with helping communicate my concepts better and more clearly. And she even actually gave me a tour when I first visited here. So she's been part of my experience for a long time. And Jen, who has opened my eyes to the world of printmaking, which has been a blast here, and just given me so much feedback and help with learning all those intense and complicated processes. And she's also really good at researching within the art world. So she's given me more suggestions for artists to look into than I even knew existed. Charles, who taught my first semester of drawing and painting here actually, and was also just really supportive with helping me communicate and find my concepts and think about how I'm actually communicating those within each piece. And Siggy, who was actually my installation instructor, and that was a great class, and she was really good at pushing me outside of my comfort zone while still allowing me to maintain my own personal voice within my work. So that's something that I appreciated, that balance of. And all the other professors that I've had in grad school as well as undergrad, I've just really felt supported by and enjoyed all my classes here. And also my fellow grad students who have been just really great friends and peers, and I've really enjoyed getting to know all of you guys. Thanks for being here. And thanks for helping me, and it's just been really great having you here to support me as well. And hopefully I hope I can return the favor as well. And my amazing wife, Hannah, and my wonderful family who are also here as well. So thanks for your time, everyone. And if you have any questions now, I'd be happy to answer those. Thank you. I see, first, before we get it too much in the questions, I see, Linda, you mentioned Kentridge. Yeah, William Kentridge is definitely, he's an artist who works with charcoal animations as well. And he's someone who I've been interested in his work for a long time. I thought about including him in those related artists that I mentioned, but I really only had time for a couple. But yeah, he's a really inspirational artist for me, especially materially, because some of his concepts are pretty different, but I really enjoy his work. Yeah, if anyone else has any questions, though, you're welcome to ask. Make sure you unmute yourself first, though.
Hey, Matthew.
Hey.
I could talk to you for hours and hours about your subject. I'm really impressed with your work, and especially the theoretical underpinnings that fuel all of this, your concepts. And my question, one of many, but one that's coming to mind right now is, kind of what your take is on higher consciousness. So you talk a lot about the duality between, you know, inside, outside, self and other, and yet I sense in your work kind of another presence. You know, like in a lot of contemporary discussions about higher consciousness or the unified field or the divine,
Yeah.
as an example, I'm curious to know how that might also fuel your questioning, and how one might also suggest that your work is almost a commentary that there is a beyond, there's a place of unity, or a place where we're not alone, but we're functioning, you know, it's kind of like the notion of isolation, and yet we're a community.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
that's a great question. I like that. I think that's insightful. I think, yeah, you know, I definitely would agree that I think these are almost, because they are inspired from my own space, my own self space, and I do believe in that higher consciousness. I am a Christian, so, but I also honestly think that when I say that word, there's a lot of baggage that comes with it. And personally, my views on God are almost closer to Baruch de Spinoza, if you're familiar with him, the philosopher, actually a medieval era kind of philosopher who basically saw God's beauty in everything, and kind of was not a pantheist, but more like a panentheist, where he kind of saw the presence of God within all of creation, basically. And so I do feel somewhat hesitant, honestly, or like I need to be careful with identifying outright as a Christian and then not leaving any context, because I think for me, a lot of the importance of it is kind of reaching outward into that beyond experience, basically, and connecting with God, or having spiritual connection through that, rather than necessarily through, like, I mean, I think religion can be an important part of that, and there are like structures and guidelines that can be helpful within that process. But sometimes I think those can create more of a barrier than a help. So it's hard to summarize those in a short time. But yeah, to summarize, yeah, I definitely that has been an inspiration within my work and within these spaces.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
I love that. Thanks so much, Matthew.
for
Such a
sure.
pleasure to see how you've developed, and I'm really honored to be a part of our family. So
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm glad you could make it here.
me too.
I saw
I have a
Fabian.
question.
Yeah, go for it, Jen.
So kind of looking at the work, I'm thinking about the work, and I'm kind of seeing relationships to like the history of landscape painting or 19th century movement of landscape painting, such as artists like Thomas Moran. And I'm interested in this monumentality of the work, and whether you've thought about or are having a dialogue with the history of landscape painting.
That's a really great question. Yeah, actually, I grew up in northern Colorado, and one of my favorite things as a kid was going with my family, or even with art classes, and to the Denver Art Museum. And they have some really great landscape paintings, especially from the Romantic era or even just after that. So Thomas Moran is someone who has just visually inspired me for a long time, but I have been really interested in the sublime within my work for a long time as well. And that's something that was a big part of that era of painting and landscape work, especially. So the sublime meaning basically creating a mixture of awe and beauty within a work that can be almost scary but powerful. That kind of monumentality is something I really enjoy and would like to include in my work. Caspar David Friedrich is one of my favorite painters of all time, and he does a great job of that. So Caspar David Friedrich is worth looking into for sure. But he's I'm sure you know them, but if you haven't yet, he's definitely worth looking into from that era. So yeah, that was a really good question. And then I think I saw Fabian mentioned, yeah, Walking by Ryan Larkin would be an interesting reference. Yeah, I would love any more suggestions for animators, because I feel like I'm just starting to get into that world. So I haven't really found all that many that I haven't really gone on, I haven't discovered all that many animators yet. One who I really like is, besides William Kentridge, is Ruth Lingford. And she is an artist who I think she actually teaches at Harvard now or something, but she does some amazing drawn animations, and they're really, really intense and interesting. So, but I would love any more suggestions for animators to look into. So I'll make sure to write down that Ryan Larkin piece.
Hey Matt, good job.
Thanks.
What do you plan on working on next after this body of work?
That's a great question. I feel I have a lot of mixed feelings now with what to work on next. I do want to continue this body of work, but I am excited to try to break into some new ones. I think just because this was my thesis focus doesn't mean that all my work for the whole rest of my life has to be within this concept or anything. So I do somewhat miss including the figure within my work, but as I mentioned, that's just not as essential to these concepts. It kind of gets in the way, but I would love to get a little more back into figurative and narrative stuff again, but I want to try to combine different materials. And that's something I've tried a few times. That blue and whitish painting with the soul figure in it that's kind of gestured in was an example of that. But for some reason, I just don't, I have a hard time pushing myself to use mixed media in the same piece. I don't know why that is. So I think that's something that I would really like to, as far as some visual differences, try to maybe break into abstraction a little bit more and combine it with representationalism, or even just try some different materials all together within the same work and see if I can get some interesting visual relationships with that. Yeah.
I just have one more thing.
Sure. Go for it.
I'm intrigued to think about the incorporation of sound.
Yes.
And, you know, obviously there's been this huge discussion about the primacy of vision within art and how our other senses are sort of, you know, left behind in the hierarchy of with vision at the top. So
Yeah.
I love that experiential, and especially the notion of how sound can take one into consciousness or higher consciousness, like the mantra. So anyway, just some, you know, kind of random things that came to mind when you talked about using sound.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I actually wrote some of that down, and I think what I sometimes picture with sound is, instead of making like a whole plot, I'm not really picturing much dialogue, although I could try experimenting with that. But I'm not usually in my head when I think about what would happen if I included sound with these pieces. Usually what I'm picturing is not necessarily like dialogue or things like that. I'm honestly picturing more often like the sound of wind through a landscape, or sand under your feet, like while it's implied that you're walking through that space. Or like the crumpling of the paper, you know, that happens in both films actually, and having just sounds with that. Or even a lot of the artists like Ruth Lingford or William Kentridge often just have music in the background that kind of matches some of their themes, which is an interesting way to support it without necessarily distracting from the visual aspect. But I would love to experiment with kind of all of those really, and just see what happens in the future with that. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. It is interesting though to find that balance, because you know, I think that's one of the main reasons I didn't include sound, is I wanted it to be a purely visual experience, and I kind of wanted the viewer to almost imagine those sounds really as they're seeing it, or and then you have a little more freedom to imagine what you want with it. So yeah. Any other questions? These are all great. Thank you guys.
Hey, great
Hey,
job.
Jonathan. Good to see you.
Yeah, I had a quick question. I know you kind of referred to it, but I wanted to know a little more about your conceptual reasons around mostly staying black and white, and then also what your interest is or likelihood is of pursuing color in the future, and just your feelings about using color versus staying monochromatic.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think for me, it actually is kind of similar to that audio aspect that I just mentioned, where I like the fact that with black and white, as a viewer, you have a little more freedom to interpret the space. And so, you know, you don't really know exactly what the colors are when you go into it. And so it seems ironic, right? Because it's like, well, it's all just on a grayscale. Isn't that less freedom? But I feel like it allows you a little more imaginary freedom, where it does tell you exactly what the colors of the space are. And if you wanted to, you can kind of picture that yourself. And I also think I'm really just drawn to the intensity of lighting and value a lot. So some of it's just a personal preference thing where, especially with charcoal, I just really enjoy dramatic lighting and value. But color is something that I would like to experiment with more. I've probably done somewhere from 10 to 15 oil paintings in my life. So I've only just barely kind of dabbled in it a little bit. But oil is a material that I'd be interested in trying more. I do love watercolor, but I'd be interested in trying some more like watercolor mixed with charcoal, and to see if, even within these spaces or within some more narrative works, if I could use color in a way that would add to them. It's just when I've made these before, I usually end up feeling like color is taken away from them for some reason. So, but yeah, that's a really great question. But that is something I've tested out in grad school and stuff. And I think I always just kind of end up feeling like when I make a piece in color, I end up thinking, well, I feel like there would be a little more conceptual or visual freedom with it if it were in black and white for some reason. So there's also even like the aspect that with black and white, it's another step away from reality. And that may be a better way of phrasing what I'm trying to say with this like imaginary freedom stuff, is it removes you one step from it being a real space. And that's actually kind of the same reason I don't really make these as three-dimensional installations, is I don't want them to feel like they're completely real. I want them to feel like you're viewing this window into this weird self space, not like actually being in a space that's literally outside of you. But yeah, that's a really good question. I definitely would like to experiment more with color more in the future, but this whole show ended up being black and white. Yes. Anyone have any other questions? I want to be sensitive with time as well if people have to get somewhere, but I'd be happy to take one or two more if anyone has anything. All right. Well, thanks for joining, everybody. I really appreciate it. I'm glad you could all be here. I did put my website in the group chat earlier, so you're always welcome to check out more of my work there, or you're welcome to contact me through there or through my email in the future. So thanks for being here. I really appreciate your time, and have a good rest of your day.